Hello and welcome to In Depth. I'm Tina Jha. India has once again expressed hope that the new government in Sri Lanka, led by the Rajapaksa brothers, will realize the aspirations of the Tamil community in the island nation. The issue figured prominently during talks between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Sri Lankan counterpart Mahinda Rajapaksa during the latter's 5-day state visit to India. Following his interaction with the Lankan Prime Minister on the long-pending Tamil issue, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said he was confident that the Sri Lankan government will realize expectations of equality, justice, peace and respect of the Tamil people within a united Sri Lanka. On this edition of In Depth, we talk about the Tamils in Sri Lanka, India's concerns about the minority population in the island country and the expectations New Delhi has of their reconciliation. Besides, we'll also get you a brief history of the decades-old ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, the genesis of the whole problem, and India's role over the years in resolving the problem. So, in his talks with the visiting Sri Lankan Prime Minister Narendra Modi reiterated his message that he hoped Sri Lanka will implement the 13th Amendment that was the centerpiece of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in 1987. Successive Lankan governments have given assurances on this, but so far there has been no movement in this regard. On Saturday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi held talks with the visiting Sri Lankan Prime Minister. One of the key points he made was that Sri Lanka needs to complete the process of devolution of power to provinces by implementing its constitution's 13th Amendment.
श्रीलंका में रिकंसिलिएशन से संबंधित मुद्दों पर हमने खुले मन से बातचीत की। मुझे विश्वास है कि श्रीलंका सरकार यूनाइटेड श्रीलंका के भीतर समानता, न्याय, शांति और सम्मान के लिए तमिल लोगों की अपेक्षाओं को साकार करेगी। इसके लिए ये आवश्यक होगा कि श्रीलंका के संविधान में 13वें संशोधन को लागू करने के साथ-साथ रिकंसिलिएशन की प्रक्रिया को आगे ले जाया जाए।
Mahinda Rajapaksa was on his first official visit to India after being appointed Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. Prime Minister Modi was reiterating the same message that he gave to Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa when he came to India soon after assuming office in November 2019. However, in January this year, soon after his election, Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa said certain areas of 13th Amendment of the Constitution cannot be implemented. He also called for politicians to look at alternative solutions. The Lankan President's objection was to police powers being handed to the provincial councils, which he said would simply lead to politicization of police work.
Tamilian community is quite broadly concentrated in Sri Lanka, in the north and northeast. In 2009, when the then government fought LTTE forces to wipe them out, and in the process, Tamilians also suffered. So they are slightly doubtful, but advantage of it is, constitutionally they have some status, because 13th Amendment was made in Sri Lankan Constitution, which gives some measure of autonomy and recognition to Tamil also as a language along with Sinhala. And that's the thing that they can live with, so they're identified, recognized as Sri Lankans.
The 13th Amendment was brought up as part of Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in 1987, and provincial councils were set up as part of devolution of powers, particularly for Tamil minorities. But devolution of land and police powers has not been implemented so far by any Sri Lankan government, although Tamil political parties have been demanding the implementation in both letter and spirit. In 2015, soon after coming to power, former Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had also promised that his government would implement the 13th Amendment within a unitary framework. But he failed to implement the 13th Amendment, as did his predecessor Mahinda Rajapaksa before him. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. For decades, India has held that the 13th Amendment is key to the process of reconciliation and also integration of the Tamil minority into Sri Lanka as mainstream. This amendment provides for devolution of powers to Tamil community in the neighbouring country. More details about the 13th Amendment in this report.
In his talks with Sri Lankan Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, Prime Minister Modi called for the implementation of 13th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution. This is a point that he has time and again emphasized during his meeting with the Sri Lankan heads. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka, or the 13A, is an amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. It came about in the 29th July 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord that was signed between then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayawardene. The agreement addressed the ethnic issue of Sri Lanka, wherein India undertook to help Sri Lanka fight the Tamil militancy, and the Sri Lankan government agreed to accommodate Tamil grievances and devolve power to them. The Sri Lankan Parliament passed the 13th Amendment by two-thirds majority in November 1987. The establishment of provincial councils, the appointment and powers of the governor of provinces, membership and tenure of provincial councils, the appointment and powers of the Board of Ministers, legislative powers of the provincial councils, alternative arrangements where there is a failure in the administrative machinery, establishment of the Finance Commission, Sinhalese and Tamil as official languages, English as a linked language, and the establishment of the High Court of the province. The amendment underlines the devolution of powers to provinces, which is one form of decentralization that provides the opportunity for local people to take part in local decisions and local programs within the national policy. Devolution of power is seen not only as a solution for ethnic, religious, indigenous or grassroots level conflicts, but also as a means of regional and local development.
One is, Tamil as a language is recognized as a very major thing, because over language, many times nationalities are emerged, nationalities are fought. Like, Bangladesh came up because of the way Urdu was dominating in Bangladesh, and they fought. So similarly, suppose you recognize Tamil as a language and Sinhala also, and English as a link language, then one of the important reasons for identity politics based on Tamilian language is taken off. Now the question comes, is Tamil population has been very dominant. They have had privileged position in the British Raj, and they also were doing well in terms of education and other fields. So they require proper status and representation in different bodies like parliament, like different political parties, and that if the mainstream parties concede somewhere, Tamilians will be better placed. But one interesting thing about Tamilians is we have Tamil Nadu as a state wherein both the parties in Tamil Nadu, DMK and AIDMK, are concerned about the future of Tamilians in Sri Lanka. And because these two parties are concerned, entire India is concerned, because India is union of states. If people in Tamil Nadu feel concerned about something just nearby in Sri Lanka, they will be also equally concerned. So somewhere Tamilians can shape India's foreign policy towards Sri Lanka, and that is their status, which is very major. And India is a powerful neighbor of Sri Lanka.
Since all the provisions of 13th Amendment were not implemented, it was called 13-. After the defeat of the LTTE in 2009, former Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa assured India as well as the international community that the government would go beyond the 13th Amendment to devolve substantial powers to the Tamil majority areas under 13th Amendment Plus. However, he never made it clear what exactly he meant by 13th Amendment Plus. Rajapaksa also talked about creating an upper house to the parliament or a senate to ensure more minority participation. Interestingly, it was reported that when former Indian Foreign Secretary Shiv Shankar Menon asked President Rajapaksa whether 13th Amendment Plus meant establishing a Senate to the Parliament, the latter had nodded in affirmation. Today, the 13th Amendment is essential for repatriation of Sri Lankan Tamilian refugees in India. These refugees had fled to India during the 2009 civil war in Sri Lanka, which led to killing of Prabhakaran, the LTTE chief. Implementation of the 13th Amendment will improve India-Sri Lanka relationship that have been marred since decades because of Tamilian issues. With inputs from Kunal, Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And with that, time for a very short break here on the program. But when we return, we'll talk about the Sri Lankan conflict in greater detail. And we'll also talk about India's role in resolving the decade-old conflict. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching In Depth. Over 70 million Tamils in Tamil Nadu have kin, community and cultural ties with the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. India has always reiterated at the highest levels the need for national reconciliation through a political settlement for the prevailing ethnic issue in Sri Lanka. In our next report, let's understand the genesis of the Tamil problem in Sri Lanka and its relevance in the Indo-Sri Lankan ties.
On May 2, 2017, in a historic move, the cabinet ministers of Government of Sri Lanka approved Sri Lanka's first national reconciliation policy. The national reconciliation policy was to serve as the state policy on reconciliation and provide to the process of national reconciliation in Sri Lanka. The national policy on reconciliation is set to fill a long-standing vacuum due to the absence of one. It aims to satisfy the need of the country for an overarching vision on reconciliation and a broad, coherent framework to steer and direct the process of national reconciliation. The policy also laid down a set of policy principles which include equality, human rights, justice and the rule of law, transitional justice, inclusivity and diversity, sustainable development, civic consciousness and others. The National Reconciliation Policy also lays down guidelines for stakeholders and actors implementing reconciliation programs and has identified some themes as critical to it. These include conflict sensitivity, cross-cultural awareness, victim-centeredness, gender responsiveness, foresight and innovation, leadership and sustainability, efficiency and effectiveness, coordination and complementarity, and clear and consistent communication. The National Reconciliation Policy includes an implementation strategy which states: mainstream the values defined in national policy on reconciliation within government institutions and existing national initiatives through annual work plans. Develop a national program and action plan for reconciliation and launch public awareness and education campaigns on the national policy on reconciliation and the national program and action plan on reconciliation.
The major demand of the Tamils at that time was there should be autonomy for the northern province, that is Jaffna, Yarpanam and the nearby areas, and also for the east, which is called Batikalova or Matakalapu in Tamil, where a lot of these hilly areas were in tea plantations, etc. A lot of Tamils work there, live there. So these provinces should get autonomy, and over a period of time they should be merged together. So if there is autonomy in these areas and also power over land and agriculture and other development activities, they will be able to do more for the people of that area. So that is their main demand, and politically then their significance will be there.
Since the end of the civil war in May 2009, the Tamil issue has dominated relationship between the Sinhalese-dominated Sri Lankan government and the Indian government. And the ties between the nations goes beyond its people and into other domains. Sri Lanka is among the major recipients of development assistance from the government of India. India's overall commitment stands close to $3 billion, out of which around $560 million are purely in grants. The Indian Housing Project, with an initial commitment to build 50,000 houses for the war-affected as well as estate workers in the plantation areas, is the Indian government's flagship project of development assistance to Sri Lanka. With an overall commitment of over Rs 1,372 crore in grants, it is one of the largest projects undertaken by the government of India abroad.
India is concerned in two ways. One is, Lankan Tamils surely, because Tamil Nadu they have to carry as a state within the union of states, that is India. And second important thing is, they are just strategically located north and northeastern part. And if you look at Sri Lanka itself is so strategic, Pak Straits, Trincomalee Island. So India looks at the overall location of Sri Lanka strategically to itself, and also overall nature of India's role in Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific region. So naturally then Indians will kind of support Tamilians of Tamil Nadu, but Tamilians of Sri Lanka also in their legitimate aspirations to find space in a democratic Sri Lanka.
Tamil Nadu's political parties to a significant degree have the power to translate Tamil Nadu's sympathy for its kin population into Indian government policy. Over 70 million Tamils in Tamil Nadu have kin, community and cultural ties with Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Hence, the need for national reconciliation through a political settlement of the ethnic issue has been reiterated by India at the highest levels. India's consistent position is in favor of a negotiated political settlement, which is acceptable to all communities within the framework of United Sri Lanka and which is consistent with democracy, pluralism and respect for human rights. With inputs from Kunal, Bureau Reports, Rajya Sabha TV.
For several decades, India has supported the Sri Lankan government in its right to fight the terrorist activities of the LTTE. But after the end of the armed conflict in 2009, rehabilitation of thousands of Sri Lankan Tamils has been a huge concern for India. In this report, let's try and understand in greater detail about the Sri Lankan conflict, India's stance and role in brokering peace in its neighborhood. Ethnic ties have bound India and Sri Lanka for more than 2,500 years. Both countries have a legacy of intellectual, cultural, religious and linguistic interaction. India is home to over 60 million of the world's nearly 77 million Tamils. 4 million Tamils live in Sri Lanka, which is nearly 9% of the country's population. Ever since its independence from British rule in 1948, Sri Lanka has been mired in ethnic conflict. In the years following independence, the majority Sinhalese, who comprise over 80% of Sri Lanka's population, resented British favoritism towards the Tamils in the colonial period. After Lanka's independence, they disenfranchised Tamil migrant plantation workers from India and made Sinhala the official language. In 1972, the Sinhala population changed the country's name from Ceylon and made Buddhism the nation's primary religion. At the height of ethnic tensions, in 1976, Prabhakaran assumed leadership of the LTTE that began a campaign from a Tamil homeland in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, where most of the island's Tamils reside. In 1983, the LTTE ambushed an army convoy, killing 13 soldiers. The incident triggered riots in which 2,500 Tamils died. India intervened by dispatching the Indian peacekeeping force in the north and east of Sri Lanka in 1987 after the Indo-Lanka agreement to establish peace and normalcy in Sri Lanka came into effect. Also referred to as the Indo-Lanka Accord, the deal was signed by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayawardene. The Indian peacekeeping force was deployed to enforce a ceasefire between the LTTE and the Sri Lankan military. However, unable to end the conflict and having lost more than 1,000 Indian soldiers, the Indian peacekeeping force withdrew from Sri Lanka. The bitter war between Sri Lankan forces and the LTTE ended in 2009 after nearly 3 decades. During the conflict, India supported the right of the government of Sri Lanka to act against terrorist forces. India's official position on the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka has always been clear and consistent. While opposing the LTTE's military and terrorist struggle for a separate state of Tamilelam, India supported greater rights for Tamils and other minorities. Under the 1987 accord with India, which was followed by the 13th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution, Colombo agreed to devolve some authority to the provinces and make Tamil an official language of the state. But no government has fully implemented the provisions. Over 7 crore Tamils in Tamil Nadu have kin, community and cultural ties with the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Even though the Ilam War made headline news in India, just as anywhere else in the world, it was the death of thousands of civilians and the sufferings of Tamils as a result of the war that have kept emotions on the boil in Tamil Nadu. With input from Kunal Singh, Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. So that's it from us on the show today. We'll be back same time tomorrow now with a focus on some other subject. Just in case you missed the television broadcast of our program, let me remind you that you can also watch it online on YouTube and Twitter, and you can also get back to us with your feedback and suggestions. Thank you for your time.